Good afternoon. My name is Rachel. I am a senior qualitative analyst here at Statistics Solutions. Welcome you to this qualitative data analysis webinar this afternoon, which will be a broad look at qualitative data analysis techniques, some tips and tricks based on your research design. We are Statistics Solutions. We are really a full service dissertation consulting company. So we provide support for all stages of the dissertation research, whether that is your introductory chapter all the way through analysis and your discussion chapter. And so if you're interested at any point in scheduling a free consult to learn a little bit more about what we can do for you, you can use the link that's presented here or email info@statisticsolutions.com. I also have Melissa with me today to provide a little bit of support for any questions that come in. So we will talk about all of this as we go along today, but there are some kind of key characteristics of qualitative data analysis, and this really is across the board for all types of qualitative analysis. So it is inductive, okay? We work our way in. So generally we have some idea, maybe a little idea of what we're looking at, but we're really open to new ideas and new possibilities in our research. So we're not working top down, we're working bottom up. It is simultaneous as well. So we conduct qualitative analysis really at a lot of different stages during a qualitative study. Oftentimes we do this along with, as we're collecting data. Okay, so we're always kind of going back and forth between data and analysis. It is iterative. Okay, it's constantly evolving and changing as we gather more data, as we learn new insights. And it's also interpretive, right? So there's this element to qualitative research where we interpret our findings, we interpret what we're learning. I want to just highlight very quickly a couple of popular qualitative research designs. These are the ones that I see most often in my clients. So the case study research design, this is where you're looking at maybe one or more cases. You have a specific example of, a phenomenon that you're really trying to understand sort of the how and the why of that phenomenon or that case. And so you might have just a single case, you might be looking across multiple cases, and you'll use a lot of different data collection methods. Typically, we see more than one data collection method. Okay, so in this case, the analysis that would follow might be something that could be useful for analyzing not just interviews, but also observational data. It could be used to analyze, maybe qualitative survey data, maybe some type of textual data, a document analysis. I also see phenomenology used a lot, and this is a particularly good research design when you're interested in how people really make sense of an experience. And so it's the focus on the lived experience. So there's the what people have experienced, and then there's the how do they make sense of that experience? How do they interpret it? So it focuses on this commonality of experience and really focusing on what is the core of the experience, what is the essence of that experience. The other design that I like to highlight, because I find it very useful for really a number of purposes in qualitative research, is a generic design. And this is really useful when your research study doesn't necessarily fit squarely within a case study or phenomenology or ethnography or grounded theory. And this allows you to sort of choose from kind of the whole buffet, if you will, of research data collection tools and analytic approaches. So there's this flexibility that it provides, and it's really helpful, I think, for novice researchers as well when your study isn't quite about lived experience. Maybe you're not really interested in how people make sense of an experience. You just want to understand what the experience is. Okay, so this can be a really good flexible approach to do that. So let's talk a little bit more about the process of data analysis. This begins early, okay? We collect data, and we do this through any number of methods. This list certainly is not exhaustive of all of the ways that we have to collect data. Interviews are probably the most common method of collecting data within qualitative research. So interviews can be one-on-one interviews. You might have focus groups where it's essentially a group interview. Those can have some real benefits. You might have data that come from field notes that you've made as you're conducting the research. Okay. Again, document analysis. You might be examining any number of documents. It could be government documents that are related to your research topic. It could be school documents if you're looking at something in an educational setting. So that's another source of data. You might also be collecting data through observations. You might be doing structured observations where you have a protocol and you're looking at your research site, you're looking for very particular things as you're doing observations. So we gather all of this data and then we need to do something with those data. And that's where the analysis comes in. Prior to data analysis is transcription of data. This can be performed either by the researcher or by a transcriptionist. And there are some pros and cons associated with each. Transcriptionists certainly can be expensive. Imagine if you have a lot of interview data, this could get pricey to have someone do the transcripts for you, the transcribing of the interviews. It also, if you pay someone to do it, if you have someone else do it, really, even if you don't pay them, you as the researcher might be missing out on some early stages of insights that you might gain as you are transcribing your own data. So you kind of have to weigh the benefits and costs associated with each side out. But we have to get from the qualitative data that, oftentimes are recorded on some recording device to paper, okay? In the transcripts, it's helpful to include information like the time and the setting, the date, who the participant was, what kind of session was it? Was it an interview? Was it a focus group? Because this provides context for your data. So anything that allows for this richer description, richer analysis is really helpful. Another thing that's helpful for data transcription that will translate into greater ease of data analysis is using wide margins, because wide margins allow us to take notes directly on the paper, and especially if you're analyzing data by hand as opposed to using a qualitative data analysis software, you want to have room to write, right? Because writing is thinking on paper. You also, and this is especially important if you're doing, say, a focus group, want to make sure that you've clearly distinguished between the speakers and demarcate where the survey or interview questions are and where the responses are. And this might seem really obvious and silly, but a lot of times as we are collecting data, we think, oh, well, I'll remember. I'll just remember this later. And then later comes and we don't remember. We don't remember who that participant was necessarily. So just to make things easy, make sure that you identify who the speaker is and where the question ends and the answer starts in all of your data. It can also be helpful to make note of incidental noises. Okay, this is particularly important for specific types of data analysis, but making note of where a participant pauses in conversation, where they laugh in conversation, where they cry, okay, all of this provides context for the interview, right? So it's good to have these kinds of information and not just the transcript of the interview itself. Once we have the data transcribed, we're ready to go, we need a way to organize it, okay? So this can also take any number of forms. If you are very comfortable using the computer, using more of a cloud-based system, get those transcripts onto your computer into a file, maybe, make it password protected, okay, because of privacy concerns. But if you want to go all digital, that's totally fine. You can also store your data in hard copy as well, using folders, maybe one folder dedicated to each participant, okay? It kind of just depends on what makes sense to you and for your study. Data grouping is part of this. Like I said, participant. You can group your data by participant. You can group by document type. Okay, so if you didn't want to group all of your data by participants, you could group all of your interview transcripts together. You could group all of your observation notes together, okay? File naming, just making sure that you have an easy way of, naming and locating those data so you know what it is you are looking at and what you're looking for when it comes to retrieving those data. And then backup, and I cannot stress this enough. Physical copies, digital copies of data, have multiple copies spread out over, a couple of different things. You might have a local file on your computer and you might use some kind of cloud-based storage as well, just to make sure that if anything happens to your computer, you have copies of your data somewhere else. And in terms of privacy concerns, then, like I mentioned before, doing things like putting password protection on those files can be really helpful. You can use encryption software to encrypt those files if you need to. So have the transcripts, we have data storage, data organization, and we can get started with data analysis. And one of the first things that you want to do with the analysis is to read your data. Go through all of your data. And this is why I say it can be very helpful to do your own transcription, because this is your first opportunity to get a general sense of your data. You explore the whole picture, okay? So you want to be very familiar with your data before you really get into the analysis. And this is a good starting point no matter what analysis plan you end up using for your qualitative study. Now, I mentioned before that some analyses can be done by hand, and this is definitely true. I mean, arguably all qualitative analyses can be done by hand, but it generally works better for smaller data sets. So if you have a couple of interviews, you may have no need to throw those into a computer program, okay? But, certainly if you have, say, 25 interviews and then you have observational data and then, oh, you've got some documents as well, a computer-based program might be a little bit easier. But analyzing data by hand can be really helpful for these smaller data sets. And you use hard copies, okay? So you want to keep copies of the original transcripts. And the way that this works is you're essentially organizing your data on paper. So remember those wide margins that we talked about as you are going through coding data. We'll talk more about this in a minute. You're making notes in the margins. You're doing this all by hand. Now, that said, you can certainly use something like Microsoft Word or word processing program to also analyze data by hand. And I know that sounds strange because that is a computer program. But in the coding process, you are highlighting or sort of taking out the important statements that participants have made. And so you can do that with a highlighter and a physical copy of paper, and you can also use a highlighting tool and a word processing program to do that. You can see how analyzing data by hand, though, might be a little more difficult the more data that we collect. So this is where qualitative data analysis software can really, really help. The main benefit of using these programs, and there are any number of programs out there, in vivo, Atlas TI, Hyper Research, Max QDA are just a couple of names that you may have heard of. At their core, they all do the same thing, and that is they assist with the organization and the management of data. The programs do not analyze data for the researcher. Researcher is still actively involved in the data analysis process, but the programs can store the data in such a way that it's easy to retrieve, for example, all passages across all participants that are coded with any given code. Okay, so it enables the researcher to sort data, to code data, and a code is just a little descriptive term that describes the contents of the code or the statement that's been coded, and then to search data, so that easy retrieval. So what you would do then when you have your transcript and you have your transcript in digital form is you upload your data into the software, and then as you're reading and making notes on your data, then you start to pull out or segment those important statements. And usually these will be statements that relate to your research questions. And so you highlight those, and sort of depending on the way that the computer program works, you'll highlight the statement and just click a button, and it'll ask you to type in the name of the code that you want, and you'll just do that in the program, and it'll store that passage of text and that code. And so then you can go back, and again, it sort of depends on the program, but it's really a process of double clicking on the code, and then you can see all of the passages that have been coded the same way. So qualitative data analysis then, really at its core, even though there are so many different types of analysis, they really all do the same thing. Okay, it just in the end depends on what you're looking for and what you're asking. Okay, so building themes or categories is a big part of data analysis, of qualitative data analysis. And what this does is it takes all of the textual data that you have from all of your interviews, from all of your observations, and it reduces the data. Okay, so we're making sense of the data. And again, it begins with this repeated reading of your data to understand the whole, understand the experience, understand the phenomenon of what your participant is talking about. So then you start coding, you segment into text fragments. You could do images as well. If you're looking at maybe photographs, you segment your data, okay, into these fragments. And then you label those fragments with the code, with the descriptive word or a couple of words. And you identify all codes across all interviews, all observations, all of your data, and start to refine all of those codes that you have identified to eliminate redundancy. Are there maybe 3 codes that actually speak to the same facet of a phenomenon? Okay, well then you can maybe just combine those. Okay, those codes are redundant, so you can combine them to eliminate the redundancy and make sure that each code matches one idea. And then codes are combined to form broader themes. So you sort of build the codes back up into categories based on how similar they are to one another. I think an example here is really helpful. So this is just a sample passage from an interview. And the participant says, I really wasn't happy with the outcome. I almost started to cry when I found out. I had worked so hard to get a good grade in the class. I felt bad that all of my hard work was for nothing. I knew that this would have a big impact on my GPA. I had to get myself together before anyone from class saw me. I didn't want them asking why I was misty-eyed all of a sudden. So to use this an example of how coding works, then let's use wasn't happy. Okay. So I really wasn't happy. So we're gonna underline this. Here I have this coded in this or outlined in this dark blue. Okay. So I really wasn't happy. So we've noted that that might be important within this passage of text. I almost started to cry. Okay. So this is maybe another aspect of being unhappy. Okay, seems important. It's part of the experience and it's part of making sense of the experience. I felt bad. Okay, so here we have another dark blue. Okay, so wasn't happy and I felt bad are potentially speaking to the same idea. Okay, started to cry is a little bit different. So we continue on and then we see misty-eyed. Misty-eyed also has something to do with crying. So what we might do then is label wasn't happy and I felt bad with the code disappointment. That's what they have in common. Wasn't happy with the outcome is expressing some sense of disappointment with the outcome, and feeling bad about this is also part of the disappointment. So there's this commonality, right? And that's the code. Okay. So it's labeling whatever that commonality is. And so in this case, disappointment. And then we have started to cry and misty-eyed. And what do they have in common? They have something to do with tearfulness. Okay. And so maybe we label that code tearfulness. And then as we continue and like I said, start to build up these larger categories from these codes, we look at what these two codes might have in common, disappointment and tearfulness. Okay. And so maybe the theme that incorporates these codes is sadness. Both disappointment and tearfulness are expressions of sadness. Okay. So that could be the theme name. So this is what we do across all of our data. We code, well, we read, we code, and we start to look for similarities in those codes. This process only changes a little bit depending on the data analysis plan and design. This is sort of the core of all qualitative data analysis. But there are some specific types of analysis. One that I see used very often is called thematic analysis. And this is where we're moving from coding to creating themes. Themes are patterns. okay? They are a group of common codes or related codes that all speak to one, say, aspect of an experience or aspect of a phenomenon. So it's a pattern, okay? And there are several steps here. One thing that I will say I really like about thematic analysis is that you can use it with different research designs. It doesn't adhere to one specifically. So it's not uh, the case that you only have to use it with a case study or only have to use it with a phenomenological design. It can be used for any number of designs. And so in thematic analysis, you begin with reading and reviewing your transcripts for a sense of the whole. You move line by line coding. So again, highlighting those important passages and just ascribing a label to those. You code all transcripts for all of your participants. So at the end of this, you will have a big long list of codes for all participants, right? It includes all of your interviews, for example. And once you have eliminated codes for redundancy, then you begin searching for themes, okay? Exploring those codes to really understand how they relate to one another, okay? So if we go back to the previous slide, then this is where the disappointment and tearfulness come in. There's a relationship between those two codes, and that relationship is an expression of sadness, and that's the theme. So we start to build this up again. Then we review those themes. We make sure that the themes are supported by the codes. Are all of the codes placed correctly in the appropriate theme? Okay, and if not, do we maybe need to do some further analysis? Okay, this is the iterative process of qualitative data analysis. It's this constant discovery and interpretation and taking what we're learning and applying it and around and around and around. Okay, that's what makes it really cool. So making sure that all of the codes fit, that they make sense, that they tell a story about that theme. Okay, and then we define the theme. What's the theme about? In our previous example, it was about sadness. Okay, so we would define that and then give it a title. And then the last step is a presentation of the findings. Okay, so for a lot of you, that would probably be in your doctoral dissertation. Now, cyclical coding, and you can see the work of Saldana for this, this should look a little bit similar, okay? So there are cycles to coding here. And again, the cyclical nature is the iterative nature of data analysis. So in the first cycle of coding, you code all of your data, okay? Really just like thematic analysis. You go through each document, whatever it is, if it's an interview transcript, if it's a document, and your first cycle of coding, words, sentences. It could be an entire page of text if it's all related to the same topic and the same facet of that topic. That's usually not the case, but it could be, certainly it is not outside of the realm of possibility. In the second cycle, then you do another pass through of analysis of your data. So you go over it again. And in this cycle, you may find the same segments to code as in the first cycle. You might be open to reinterpretation of a passage. Maybe it doesn't deserve this code. It should go, it should become a different code. So the codes might change here, but it's sort of another exploration, analysis of your data. And you can code in different ways. So you can assign descriptive codes, and descriptive codes are where you as the researcher come up with your own little descriptive title of that code. Okay, so as in the example with tearfulness and disappointment. Nothing in this passage says disappointment or says tearfulness directly. Those words are not used. Okay, so this is an example of a descriptive code. You're coming up with your own term or phrase to describe the codes. In vivo coding is where you would use the participant's own words as the title for the code. Okay, so you would, maybe the code would be, I felt bad. Okay, and that would be your code. Both are perfectly appropriate in your research and in your analysis. You can also code by pattern, simultaneous coding. And so here, this is good if maybe you have opposing views about an experience. Okay. And so it doesn't fit nicely into, um, you know, a code. I'm going to go back to this example as well. So, if in this study we're looking at, this experience of receiving a grade, okay, and this participant had a bad experience, a bad outcome, was disappointed, was tearful, knew that it would have a big impact on the GPA. But let's say we have another participant who scored a perfect score, okay, and they were really excited, they had studied really hard, they felt really good about it. These are going to be different codes, okay? We might code that other hypothetical participant with happiness, excitement, but they're speaking to the same pattern, okay, which is the experience of finding out their grade. Okay, so we can also code in that way. And just like in thematic analysis with cyclical coding, we can categorize our codes. And here we categorize them into categories. They're not necessarily called themes specifically, okay? But again, themes are categories. So you see how the process is breaking down the transcripts into these different components, okay, the codes, and then starting to build the sort of core of what you're looking at, what you're exploring in your research, using those codes and looking at the patterning amongst them. There are other types of data analysis. Both of these are a little bit more advanced and they do adhere to particular research designs. Okay, so I bring these up to show you the variation that we see in qualitative data analysis, but also that certainly there are some analyses that you would want to use with a particular research design, but also to show you that still the process is very similar. Okay, so interpretative phenomenological analysis, okay, which is a really particular type of phenomenological analysis. And if this is what you're doing, then this will be your research design as well. It is essentially an application of thematic analysis to each interview, one at a time. So you would take your first interview and you would code that interview and you would read it and you would make notes and you would code it and you would explore the patterns and the ideas, the themes in the code. And then you would create those themes for the first interview. And then you would move on to the second. So instead of building up your code list for all of your participants, you're building up the codes and the themes for each interview, for each participant. Okay. At the end, you bring those themes together, okay? And these become superordinate themes. So you are still probably going to end up with something similar to what you might find in thematic analysis or in cyclical coding, okay? It's just that the steps are a little bit different. Van Cam, or modified Van Cam, is also similar. It uses a lot of really different terminology, but it's basically the same. So the preliminary coding step, which again, we've established that we do across any kind of qualitative data analysis, in this method is called horizontalization, which is just a fancy way of saying coding. Okay, so I don't want you to be scared off, by hearing this sort of new terminology, because at its core, it's the same process. And so here you treat all data equally. Nothing is more or less important, okay, as you're coding. So you are open to any and all ideas and exploring any and all ideas that your data have for you. Then you do reduction and elimination. This is where you list all of those quotes that you have come up with during horizontalization, and you ask a couple of questions of those quotes. Is the quote important to the participant's lived experience? If not, you get rid of that quote. The second question is, can this quote be reduced to its latent meaning or its core meaning? And if not, then you eliminate the quote. Okay, so you code everything, you have your list of quotes, and then you ask these two questions. And if the answer is no to either of them, you eliminate the quote. So you're left with a list of quotes or excerpts that passed these tests. Okay, and so you start to group those together into themes based on this core meaning. Okay, from there, and this is a phenomenological approach, and so it is more concerned with the interpretation or making sense of the core, the essence of the experience. You, for each participant, create a textual description and a structural description. And so the textual description uses the exact excerpts and quotes verbatim from participants. The structural description is the interpretation, okay? The description that explores the connections between these statements, the how something was said. So the textual description is the what was said, and the structural is the how it was said, okay? From there, we create a composite textual and structural synthesis across all of the participants. So you're bringing all of this together for all of your participants. And then ultimately, this leaves you with a synthesis of the structural textural description where you bring them back together. And so again, in the end, you have a presentation of these categories of meaning in participants' own words, and then how you make sense of those words, how they are interpreted. Okay, so hopefully you can see with these examples of data analysis, again, that the core is really very similar, and you'll likely end up in the same place at the end. Now, we present our findings oftentimes in narrative form. This is really the most commonly used in qualitative data because this makes sense, right? We're looking at words primarily. We might be looking at video, we might be looking at photograph, but usually it's words. And so we write our findings, we present our findings in a narrative format. But we can also provide tables, figures, maps, diagrams, demographic tables, all of these methods of presenting findings can be found in a qualitative, results chapter. Maps, for example, maybe you are doing a case study with an elementary school. And so part of that is really understanding the layout of the classroom. Okay, that is really important for context. And so maybe you have something in the chapter that shows this for the readers. Okay, you don't have to use all of these. You don't have to use any of them, other than narrative form, but it can be really helpful to visualize qualitative data in some other ways. So this concludes the qualitative data analysis webinar. Like I said, we are Statistics Solutions, so we provide full service dissertation consulting for graduate students at really any stage of the dissertation, research and writing process. And so all of our contact information for additional support you can find here on this last slide. We have email address, telephone number, and again, we would love to hear from you about your own dissertation needs. And so we do provide a free 30-minute consultation to, sort of best figure out how we can help you. Okay, learn a little bit more about your project, what you are in need of, and how we can fill that role. So if there are questions now, I invite you to put those into the questions pane and I can answer those. What I will do is read the questions out loud and then answer them for everyone so that everybody gets to hear the questions and then the responses as well. And so again, really just to kind of recap, we touched on some data collection methods, just a really kind of high level overview of qualitative designs and then the analysis process. So any questions about any of that I can answer for you? So the question is, does your organization help with dissertation? Yes, that is exactly what we do. Any stage that you are at with the dissertation process, we are here to help. We can help with your prospectus, with your proposal, help you out with IRB. We can help you out with your analysis and your discussion chapters. And so, again, I do encourage you to schedule the complimentary consultation because we can talk then a little bit more about what you need. And so in terms of the starting fees, that is really highly dependent on what your unique needs are. Yep, and again, you can schedule that consultation using the link or emailing info@statisticssolutions.com. So I have a question. Any thoughts on using digital transcription? I do have some thoughts about that. I know that there are a lot of very attractive and appealing tools available for recording interviews, and then they say that they will sort of automatically transcribe them into text. I caution my clients not to use these. I know how attractive they can be. I know how appealing they are. It skips over the whole transcription process. It sounds like it's going to make our lives so much easier, but I have not seen good quality, accurate outcomes from digital transcription. I do still think it is best to either, the researcher transcribes or hires someone to do the transcription. It takes longer and it can cost more, but there are few things worse than completing all of your interviews, and let's say that you have 15 or 20 hours worth of interviews, and you get to the end and you realize that the transcriptions are inaccurate, and there's nothing you can do at that point about it. So I will always advise to transcribe by hand. The next question is, does your organization help with transcribing? We outsource that. And so we we can do that. We also have recommendations for transcription services. If you are looking for help with transcription, rev.com is a good place to look for transcription. They're very, very quick with turnaround. I think a lot of times once we get our data, we get kind of excited and gung ho and think that, oh, I'll just do my own data transcription. And my experience, at least, was that it was really worth it to hire someone to transcribe my data for me. I have another question about focus groups. And the question is, when we transcribe focus groups and coding, do we need to break them down to individuals? That is, well, there are a couple of different ways to do this. I generally do not break them down into the individual, but I make sure in the coding process that it's very clear who said what. So I know who the codes and the quotes are attributable to. Um, Really for organization, but also, you want to be able to, um, let's see. So if you're using like computer software, so I work with in Vivo a lot, and one of the sort of challenges with it with focus groups is that it can look like you have a number of references within a certain code. And if that's a focus group, it can look like it was a lot of different participants who whose quotes supported that code, but in reality, it may have only been one participant. So it's worthwhile to make sure that you sort of know where those data are coming from. The other thing that you can do is simply separate the focus group transcript out by participant. That gets a little bit, the sort of one con of doing that is you still really want to get a sense of the whole, because you want to have the context. One of the benefits of the focus group is that people are able to sort of spitball off of each other. Some participant says something, and then it triggers a thought for another participant, and so then they speak on it. And so you want to have a clear sense of the whole. If you can do that by breaking the focus group down into transcripts by participant, then certainly you could do that. It's kind of whatever makes sense to you, really. You see some people saying, yeah, having to do Zoom meetings and groups with COVID. And I would just really treat that the same as you would if you were live face to face in a focus group. There's no real reason you why there would be a big difference. You have, just make sure that you've got the audio recording so that then it can be transcribed later on and that you're really clear on who each participant is so that you can get those labeled into the transcripts. Can I answer any other questions about qual data analysis? Have a question. Is there a preference for one-to-one interviews versus focus groups for phenomenological? I generally would recommend the one-to-one interview as opposed to a focus group for phenomenology. I think, because you really want depth to the interview, good phenomenological data are going to be, an hour and a half to 2 hours of an interview. And you really want to be able to get to the core of that experience with your participant. And that is just more challenging to do in a focus group. And certainly depending on your topic, it may be the case as well that a participant isn't willing to open up in the same way in a focus group than they would be in a one-on-one interview. Okay, the next question is, generally speaking, what's a good number of participants for a phenomenological study? This is a this is a tricky question to answer. Um, you may be able to get away with somewhere between, I would say, 10 and 12 participants. Um, However, my general advice is look to your literature, look to see what other researchers who have done work related to your own have done in terms of sample size. Certainly, you want to make sure that you reach data saturation. That's kind of the key thing. And so there are some studies that have suggested saturation can be reached with a really small sample. I I tend to think we need a few more. So I would say, probably aiming for 10 to 12 is good, but it's also a good idea to put into your proposal that you will, if you've done 12 interviews and you're still seeing new ideas emerge from your participants, they're talking about different aspects of the experience that other participants haven't, then you're not done interviewing. So you want to fully exhaust or saturate the data so that across all your participants, you're at a point where another interview isn't going to give you any new information. Are there other questions I can help with? The question is about editing services. Are you talking about things like APA editing or more of the sort of like research part of things? Certainly, you know, yeah. Okay, so more clarification here, completing the literature review or a section and needing someone to um, read over it before submitting. Yes, that is absolutely part of what we do. Um, so, so, we provide consulting with the different chapters of the dissertation. And as we do that along the way, as we make sure that your research methods align and your problem and your purpose and your research questions align and all of that, we also make sure that things look presentable, if you will, in that chapter. So making sure that it's grammatically correct and there aren't glaring spelling errors or anything like that. We're not going to leave you hanging in that way. And we do also offer help with quantitative dissertations. And my colleagues run some other webinars related to quantitative data analysis and methods if you're interested in those. Okay, well, thanks so much, everyone, for attending this afternoon. We will email out a copy of today's webinar. That should be to all of you tomorrow. So if you need to review anything that we discussed today, that'll be in there. Otherwise, again, make sure to schedule a 30-minute complimentary consultation about your dissertation needs, okay? So we can talk a little bit more about how we can help you with your qualitative or quantitative dissertations, and have a lovely afternoon. Take care.